Good morning, saints of the churches, and welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Sermon. 7 words to the cross. Week number 5, the late word. The Old Testament reading is from the Psalms, Psalm 57, verse 4. My soul is among lions. I must lie among those who breathe forth fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows, and whose tongues are sharp words. And from the New Testament, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 19 through 22. And Pilate wrote an inscription also and put it on the cross. And it was written, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. This inscription was read by many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests came to Pilate and said, Do not write that Jesus was King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. And Pilate answered them and said, What I have written, I have written. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. Have you ever been in a situation where some insensitive person has insulted you, and later as you reflected back on what was said, you thought of a whole litany of appropriate responses you might have said back? Could have said back, maybe even should have said back, but did not say. I'm sure you've heard it said that hindsight is 20/20. Well, this saying has never been more truthful than it is in this situation. Of all the words spoken to the cross of Jesus Christ, none is more reminiscent of this thought than the words of Pontius Pilate in response to the complaints of the Jews. And although Pilate has rightly gone down in history as the one who sentenced Jesus to death on the cross, the words he had with Jesus and the several exchanges between them had on their own at least a hint of courage coming from him, and perhaps even a certain nobility of character. Now, I know I'm being generous here. Unfortunately, because of the gravitas of the situation and the irrational fears he had for his position as governor of Judea, by the time he got around to making his testimony for Christ, his word came too late to make a difference for him. Hindsight is indeed 20/20. God rest his soul. It has been said that the key to the delivery of a good joke is in the timing. In this way, even a good joke will not be funny if the timing is bad. No Roman leader of history is more widely known to us today, except perhaps Julius Caesar or Nero, than is Pontius Pilate. This is a surprising fact when you consider he was governor of what was in Roman times a small and quite insignificant province. But literally millions of Christians have spoken his name this very day, including all of us here this morning as we recited together the Apostles' Creed. As procurator or governor of Judea, he had the full weight of Roman law and authority behind every decision that he made. As to his abilities, there can be little doubt he was capable to do the work. He had held the post for a number of years at the time of Jesus' trial, so he must have been doing a good job by Roman standards, because if this had not been the case, he would have long since been recalled by the emperor. The critics and pundits of his time often wrote of a tendency he had to be stubborn and unyielding, which often made more trouble than was necessary for him. And you know, if you look deeply at the text, you can see where he was almost gone out of his way to tweak the noses of the Jews regarding their ancient superstitions and religion. It's almost as if he wanted to upset their delicate social norms by walking all over their cherished traditions. But in spite of this seeming bent for stubbornness and refusing the will of the people, the moment for which he is most remembered will be forever the moment he caved in, finally, to the pressures of democracy via mob rule. And when at last, at the very end, he finally put his foot down and chose to show some backbone, the action was too little and too late. The story itself began very early in the morning before dawn, when the chief priests brought Jesus to Pilate, demanding his execution. After hearing their request, Pilate asks them, What charges do you bring against him? And when the Jews responded that he wished to make himself king, Pilate asked the immortal question, "Are you king of the Jews?" Now, we cannot be sure of the seriousness of his question and as to the direction he was taking the conversation. Was he trying to conduct a legal investigation, or was he making a play on words to annoy the Jews? It's hard to tell. But for his part, Jesus immediately picks up on the ambiguities at work in their exchange of words, and he asks him, "Do you want to know this truth for yourself? Or do you want the textbook version that's believed by everyone else?" This was where Pilate had the chance to answer to the Son of God for himself. And he quickly backed away in fear of the mob, as most of us would do when the pressure was on, I might add. Adding further linguistic ambiguity to the exchange by posing the insipid question, "I'm not a Jew, am I?" At any rate, the conclusion that was arrived at by Pilate did not warrant the death sentence desired by the Jews. So he decides that perhaps a good whipping would provide the double cure of both placating the Jewish authorities and shutting Jesus up. However, somewhere in the proceedings, Pilate gets a message from his wife, who's had a bad dream about Jesus, and who tells him, for his own eternal well-being, to not have any further dealings with Jesus. But Pilate's demonstrations of stubbornness and intransigence has not won him favor with the Jewish mob. And so when he tries to arrange for Jesus' release via a prisoner exchange program, the crowd rejects his proposals outright, and worse yet, goes after him personally, saying in John 19:12, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be king is an enemy of the emperor." Whoa, this was not what Pilate wanted to hear coming from the crowd. And this was also where I think he began to realize that he was no longer in control of the decision that would be made concerning the fate of Jesus. And you know, folks, this is where I've always felt kind of sorry for those who would be kings and those who would be presidents and governors. Because here we have a man who has all the authority and the power of the greatest empire in the history of the world behind him, and we see him desperately jockeying for position, like a schoolboy, to have some say in saving the life of one pathetic Jew. And so we hear him ask the mob one more time, almost pleading with them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And I can imagine his heart sinking as he hears their reply, "We have no king but Caesar," which he knows is not the truth, but which he also knows he has no argument against. And for all intents and purposes, mob rule has won the day. But Pilate, man that he was not about to give up the game just yet. And while assuredly it was true that his hand was not a strong one, he had one more card to play, and now was the time to put it down. Because you see, friends, according to the dictates of Roman law, in the case of a crucifixion, the crime must be posted on the cross above the head of the criminal. So as they took Jesus to the place of crucifixion, Pilate prepared the sign to be posted, and to make sure that everyone knew what the crime was, he posted it in 3 official languages. The 3 official languages, by the way, that were most in use in Judea in 33 AD. That would have been Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Thus the inscription, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." Of course, this did not make the Jewish authorities very happy, because this troublesome desert prophet was no king by their standards. So they angrily complained to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but that he merely said he was King of the Jews." And here Pilate finally says, "This is my time," and puts his foot down with curt finality in the words, "What I have written, I have written." This last late word of Pilate, spoken out of place and out of time, was the saddest words of all the words spoken to the cross of Jesus Christ. This late word spoken after the issue was decided was more pathetic than all the rest put together. Because when the truth was on the table and the life of an honest man was at stake, the best Pilate could manage to say about him was blurted out in a burst of obstinate valor after the fact, "What I have written, I have written." But do not wag your heads and say, "Oh, shame, shame on him." Oh no. Because we are all much more like Pilate than we would ever want to believe. How many times, count them if you can, have you been unwilling to stand up and give a testimony for Christ? How many times have you waited in giving your testimony until the issue at hand had already been decided and there was no longer any enemy to be feared? It's oh so easy to know what we could have said, might have said, maybe even should have said after the crisis has passed. In fact, we know what we should have said so well, we can almost hear ourselves saying it, and even believe that we did say it, even if we didn't say it in so many words. Of course, we wanted to set the matter right, because we all knew what the truth was, but, well, you know. Yes, my friends, we do know. I know, and you know. We all know. All too well, we know. Winston Churchill once said that courage is the first human virtue because it is the virtue that guarantees all the rest. I've often been amazed at the deep convictions expressed by people concerning certain issues after the fact, and how much easier it is to weigh in when your weight no longer matters. And so we wait like Pilate until the moment of cause is finally and fully lost to confide to our fellow cowards that I really did want to get involved and do what was right, but the opportunity never afforded itself to me. Friends, in Jesus Christ, there is only now. And now is always the right time to get involved, when now concerns the righteousness of God. And I'm not just referring to the great public issues of our time, same-sex marriage or abortion or disaffiliation in the Methodist Church, because most of the best opportunities that will require a courageous commitment to God's righteousness will most often happen for us in the private issues of our relationships and everyday living. And do not think that Pilate's greatest sin was his late word in his reply to the cross, but rather his late word in his reply to Jesus Christ. Pilate was quick to call Jesus King of the Jews, but when it came to answering for himself, he had nothing to say. Pilate was ready enough to place everyone else under the lordship of Christ, that is, everyone else but him. Friends, the right time to stand for God's righteousness was standing right in front of Pilate, and he sat himself down in his own judgment seat and said nothing. In his dialogue with Jesus, Pilate has the chance to go beyond the external business of being governor, which is at hand, to do eternal business with the Son of God. And he lets that opportunity slip right through his fingers. My dear friends, we cannot transact any business with heaven until we accept its truth for ourselves. God is not interested in what truth we may want for others. He wants to know what truth we want for ourselves. This is what it means to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. The truth of whether Jesus is king was settled a long time ago. We must either accept or reject this truth for ourselves. There is no other proposition of heaven that is available to us. Former President Harry S. Truman used to have a sign on his desk that read, "The buck stops here." Regarding the ultimate issues of the human soul, the buck stops here with the decision that we make for ourselves for Christ. And try as he did, Pilate could not wash his hands of the decision he had made concerning Jesus by trying to make him someone else's king. But I do feel for Pilate. I do. Because, like him, I have tried many times to pass the buck regarding the state of my own soul to someone else when I should have made that decision for myself. Well, my friends, it's decision time. We have an opportunity before us this very day to make the decision to do some eternal business with God. Like he did to Pilate, Jesus is asking us just one question, a very simple question. He says, "Will you let me be your king?" Will you speak up for God and let Jesus be your Lord today, or will you continue to hold back and wait in silence until it's too late to make a difference. Regarding the importance and the power of speaking a good word at the right time, I want to end today by sharing a little poem on the subject that I wrote for you all. A careless word may kindle strife. A word of scorn may wreck a life. A bitter word may hate instill, and a brutal word may strike and kill. A faithful word may smooth the day. A word of courage light the way. A timely word may lessen stress, but a late word denies the rest. Amen and amen.